thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light to guide my way.
In our last video, we began this section on how to evaluate the immediate context. If you missed it, I hope you'll go back and pick it up. Our next rule should be common sense, but gets ignored at times. It is number 3, look for an explanation given by the author or speaker. Authors and speakers frequently explain their own words. Although the Lord explained the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37, this prophecy is frequently misinterpreted. Ezekiel is prophesying during the captivity when the people of Israel have been carried off to other lands. The Lord tells Ezekiel and the reader that the bones represent the whole house of Israel, rather than all of mankind, as it's sometimes misinterpreted. He also explains that their resurrection represents their return from captivity. I know making this text refer to the final resurrection, it really sounds good at first glance, but we have to believe the explanation given in the immediate context. Understanding the parable of the sower would have been impossible without an explanation. In fact, the disciples asked about Jesus' use of parables, and he spoke of hiding his meanings from all but these disciples. However, Jesus did explicitly tell them what the parable meant. We must be satisfied with that explanation. When parables are explained, we should beware of embellishing them with additional meanings in an effort to prove unrelated doctrinal points. Jesus also explained the parable of the tares in Matthew 13, beginning at verse 37. This is an impressive look at the judgment, but what we understand must be the result of what has been explained by Jesus, not by our own ideas forced upon it. This happens when people try to create a difference in the order of sorting between the tares and the bad fish in Matthew 13:48. In an attempt to give the parable of the dragnet a different significance, only part of the parable is read. This is a logical error called special pleading. However, the wicked are still said to be taken from among the righteous in verse 49. Now, rule number 4. About whom is the author or speaker speaking? This is very important. Many of the same considerations as the preceding point apply here. For example, Luke is very careful with his pronouns in the book of Acts. We can actually trace when Luke was traveling with Paul and when he stayed behind. The pronouns he and they indicated Luke was not with Paul. The pronouns we and us indicated Luke was with Paul. When Luke uses pronouns, we can determine about whom he is speaking. The same is true with the remainder of Scripture. Not to get started on another subject, but this is the importance of the gender in pronouns. If pronouns in Scripture were all changed to be gender neutral, many texts would become unintelligible because the antecedent would no longer provide clarity. And I might say that that is true of society in general and communication. We talked about antecedents in video number 27 if you need a little more information on that. Well, thank you for taking a few moments to study with me. In our next video, we'll be looking at one very, very important rule of context, and I hope you'll be back to study with me.